There is a moment happening quietly across America right now that almost nobody talks about openly. It happens in parking lots outside grocery stores, in apartment kitchens late at night, in cars during lunch breaks. A person opens their banking app, looks at the number left after rent, utilities, insurance, groceries, and fuel, and realizes they are working constantly, yet somehow moving backward anyway. Not poor enough to qualify for help, not wealthy enough to feel safe, just permanently one emergency away from collapse. And that feeling is becoming so common that it is starting to reshape how millions of Americans experience daily life. Because in 2024, the United States recorded the highest homelessness level ever measured in modern history. More than 770,000 people were homeless on a single night. But the detail buried inside that number is the part that changes the entire story. A growing share of those people were employed. They had jobs. Some worked full-time. Some worked multiple jobs. And it still was not enough to guarantee a place to live. That fact breaks one of the oldest promises in the American economy. For generations, people believed stability could be earned. Not luxury, not yachts or mansions, just stability. If you worked hard, showed up consistently, avoided major mistakes, you could build a life that at least felt secure. A roof, food in the fridge, a little savings for emergencies, the sense that next month would probably be okay. Now millions of people are discovering something much more unsettling. The rules changed while they were still following them. And what makes this crisis so difficult to recognize is that it does not look like the recessions Americans were trained to fear. There are no breadlines stretching around buildings. No sudden stock market collapse wiping everything out overnight. The economy, on paper, still looks functional. Unemployment has remained relatively low. Corporate profits in many industries remain strong. Headlines continue using words like resilient. But underneath those headlines, something slower and far more destabilizing has been spreading through the country for years. Life itself became more expensive faster than normal work could keep up. Not dramatically all at once. Quietly. Incrementally. Rent climbed. Then groceries. Then insurance premiums. Then utilities. Then healthcare deductibles. Then interest rates. Every increase looked manageable on its own. Together, they changed the mathematics of survival for millions of households. And the psychological effect of that pressure is enormous. Researchers studying financial stress have found that when people are forced to constantly manage scarcity, calculating which bill gets paid first, which expense can wait, which emergency can be absorbed, the brain starts dedicating massive amounts of energy simply to short-term survival. Long-term planning becomes harder. Decision fatigue increases. Stress becomes chronic instead of temporary. In other words, financial pressure is not just draining bank accounts. It is draining mental bandwidth. That is why so many people today feel exhausted in ways they struggle to explain. They are not just working jobs anymore. They are managing instability full-time behind the scenes of their own lives. And once you see what is actually happening underneath the numbers, it becomes impossible to look at the modern American economy the same way again. Because this is no longer just a story about poverty. It is a story about how close ordinary working life has moved toward the edge. The first place that edge becomes visible is housing. Because housing is not just another monthly expense. It is the foundation every other part of life gets built on. And when that foundation starts absorbing too much income, the entire structure above it begins to weaken, even for households that look financially stable from the outside. Right now, more than 22 million renter households across the United States are considered cost-burdened, meaning they spend over 30% of their income just on housing. But that number alone almost understates the real situation. More than 12 million households are spending over half their income simply to keep a roof over their heads. Half. Before groceries. Before electricity. Before childcare. Before fuel. Before health insurance. Before a single dollar goes into savings. At that point, a household budget stops functioning like a plan for the future. It becomes a system for managing emergencies in real time. And this is where the misunderstanding around financial struggle in America starts to fall apart. Most people still imagine financial instability as something caused by unemployment or irresponsible spending. But increasingly, the pressure is hitting households that are employed, disciplined, and trying to do everything correctly. Teachers, delivery drivers, office workers, medical assistants, skilled tradespeople, families with incomes that would have looked perfectly stable a decade ago. The problem is not always that people stopped earning. The problem is that the baseline cost of existing moved faster than earnings did. Imagine a family paying $1,400 a month in rent. Their lease renews, and suddenly it is $1,750. An extra $350 a month does not sound catastrophic when viewed in isolation. But reality never arrives in isolation. That increase lands at the same time grocery prices are higher than they were a few years ago. Utility bills fluctuate unpredictably. Car insurance premiums rise. Fuel costs remain elevated. Healthcare deductibles reset. Interest rates make debt more expensive. Every category quietly demands more money simultaneously. And so households begin adapting in ways that look small at first, but become deeply consequential over time. Savings contributions stop. Retirement deposits get paused. Credit card balances stop shrinking. Emergency funds slowly disappear. That last one matters more than almost anything else. Because once a household loses its financial buffer, every unexpected problem becomes dangerous. A dead car battery is no longer annoying. It is destabilizing. A minor medical bill is no longer inconvenient. It competes with rent. A missed week of work is no longer recoverable through savings. It triggers debt. This is why the Federal Reserve has continued tracking one deceptively simple question for years. Could you cover a $400 emergency expense without borrowing money or selling something? For a significant share of Americans, the answer is no. And what makes that statistic so unsettling is not the number itself. It is what the number represents. $400 is not a catastrophic event. It is a car repair, a dental visit, a broken appliance, the kind of expense that previous generations of middle-class households often absorbed without life significantly changing afterward. Today, for millions of people, that same expense creates real financial stress. And the stress does not come from laziness or recklessness. It comes from the fact that modern household budgets have become so compressed that there is almost no room left for error. That changes the psychology of everyday life in ways economic charts rarely capture. People stop feeling secure even while employed. They stop trusting their own financial future. They begin treating stability as temporary instead of normal. And once a society reaches that point, something deeper than economics starts changing. People become more cautious, more anxious, less willing to take risks, less likely to move, start businesses, change careers, or invest in long-term goals. Because when survival already feels fragile, uncertainty stops feeling exciting. It starts feeling dangerous. That is the hidden cost of affordability pressure. It does not just reduce purchasing power. It quietly changes how an entire population thinks about the future. And nowhere does that psychological shift become more visible than in the American paycheck itself. Because technically, wages did rise over the past several years. Employers raised pay across many industries. Hourly rates increased. Salaries got larger. On paper, workers appear to be earning more money than they were 5 or 10 years ago. But this is where the numbers become deeply misleading. A bigger paycheck only matters if it buys a bigger life. And for millions of Americans, it doesn't. A worker making $18 an hour a few years ago might now be earning $21 or even $23. That sounds like progress. Until you compare it against what happened to rent, groceries, healthcare premiums, insurance, childcare, and transportation during the exact same period. The paycheck grew. The cost of surviving grew faster. Economists call this real wage stagnation. And despite how technical that phrase sounds, most Americans already understand it emotionally without needing the terminology. It is the reason so many people say some version of the same sentence lately. I make more money than I used to, so why does life feel harder? Because the raise often disappeared before it was ever truly felt. The additional income gets absorbed instantly by higher living costs. Rent consumes more. Food consumes more. Insurance consumes more. Debt payments consume more. The increase never becomes breathing room. It becomes maintenance. A household running faster simply to remain in the same place. And once that pattern continues for long enough, people begin making adaptations that slowly reshape their entire lives. First, discretionary spending disappears. Dining out becomes rare. Vacations become smaller or vanish entirely. Streaming subscriptions get canceled one by one. People delay replacing old phones, worn shoes, aging furniture, unreliable vehicles. Entire categories of consumption quietly shrink, not because people suddenly became financially responsible, but because they are reallocating money towards survival-level necessities. Then comes the deeper shift. Long-term financial planning starts collapsing. Retirement contributions get reduced. Emergency savings stop growing. Investments pause. Debt balances remain permanently present instead of temporary. A growing number of Americans are no longer building wealth. They are managing erosion. And perhaps the most dangerous part is that this erosion is mostly invisible from the outside. Someone can appear perfectly stable while privately carrying enormous financial strain. They still go to work. They still pay bills. They still show up socially looking normal. But behind the scenes, the margin protecting them from crisis has vanished. That hidden fragility changes behavior in ways that rarely get discussed honestly. People stay in jobs they hate because losing income for even a few months feels impossible to survive. Workers stop negotiating aggressively for better opportunities because uncertainty itself becomes financially threatening. Couples delay having children. Young adults postpone moving out. Families avoid relocating even for better career prospects because the moving costs and housing risks feel too dangerous. The economy starts trapping people psychologically before it traps them financially. And then there is another reality sitting underneath all of this that makes the situation even harder to escape. The categories becoming most expensive are not luxuries. They are the core systems people need to participate in modern American life at all. Housing, healthcare, transportation, education, food. These are not optional upgrades. They are entry requirements. In many cities today, researchers estimate that a genuinely livable wage, not luxury, not wealth, just enough for stable housing, food, healthcare, transportation, and minimal savings, often exceeds $30 an hour for a single adult and climbs dramatically higher for families. Yet millions of full-time jobs still pay far below that threshold, which creates a brutal contradiction at the center of the modern economy. The country continues telling people that work is the path to stability while simultaneously expanding the gap between what work pays and what stability actually costs. And when enough people start experiencing that contradiction personally, trust in the system itself begins to weaken. Not all at once. Quietly. People stop believing hard work guarantees security. Then they stop believing the future will necessarily improve. Then they stop feeling connected to the economic success stories they hear on television because those stories no longer resemble their own lives. That emotional disconnect is one of the most important shifts happening in America right now. Because economies are not sustained by numbers alone. They are sustained by belief. The belief that effort leads somewhere. The belief that stability is achievable. The belief that the next generation will live better than the last one. And when those beliefs begin eroding across millions of working households at the same time, the consequences spread far beyond personal finance. They begin reshaping the emotional foundation of the country itself. You can actually see that emotional shift most clearly in the smallest everyday decisions. Not in stock markets. Not in government reports. In grocery stores. A parent standing in an aisle comparing two versions of the same product, calculating which one stretches further. Someone quietly putting items back before checkout because the total climbed higher than expected. Families switching from fresh foods to cheaper processed alternatives not because they want to, but because the monthly math leaves fewer choices than it used to. Over the last several years, grocery prices across the United States rose sharply enough that millions of households changed how they eat entirely. And what makes this important is not simply that food became more expensive. It is that food is one of the few expenses people interact with emotionally almost every single day. Rent hits once a month. Groceries remind people every week that their purchasing power changed. The USDA reported that more than 13% of American households experienced food insecurity during 2024. That phrase sounds clinical, but the reality behind it is deeply human. It means periods where families could not consistently access enough food or enough nutritious food because the money simply was not there. And again, many of these households were employed. That detail matters because it completely changes the psychology of financial stress. Hunger in the public imagination is often associated with extreme poverty or unemployment. But modern affordability pressure increasingly affects people who technically appear integrated into the workforce and economy. That is what makes this crisis feel so disorienting. People are participating in the system and still struggling to maintain basic stability inside it. Utilities create the same pattern in a quieter way. Electricity, heating, water, internet. These are no longer background expenses. In many regions, Illinois should not feel fragile. That's what makes its story so important. This is a state anchored by one of the most economically significant cities on Earth. Chicago is not a declining industrial outpost struggling to stay relevant. It is a global financial hub, a transportation capital, a center for healthcare, logistics, manufacturing, food distribution, higher education, and corporate headquarters. O'Hare remains one of the busiest airports on the planet. Some of America's largest companies operate here. By almost every traditional economic measure, Illinois possesses advantages most states would envy. And yet, for years now, people have been quietly leaving. Not in dramatic waves. Not because of one catastrophe. Not because entire industries vanished overnight. The pattern is subtler than that, which is exactly why it matters. A retired couple decides Indiana's property taxes make more sense. A small business owner relocates operations to Tennessee after running cost projections for the third consecutive year. A young accountant accepts a position in Dallas and realizes the difference in housing affordability changes their entire long-term future. Individually, these decisions look personal. Collectively, they reveal something structural. Illinois has spent years confronting a slow-moving pressure created by the accumulation of costs. High property taxes in many counties, pension obligations weighing heavily on public finances, rising living expenses, and persistent concerns about whether future tax burdens will continue increasing to sustain aging fiscal commitments. And here's the critical point. People can tolerate almost any single expense increase temporarily. What changes behavior is compounding pressure. That's the difference between inconvenience and exhaustion. Insurance increases. Utilities rise. Tuition climbs. Childcare becomes harder to afford. Property taxes escalate faster than income growth. That there is never enough margin for life to simply go wrong for a moment. And the human brain was never designed to operate under that kind of constant calculation indefinitely. Researchers studying scarcity and chronic financial stress found that prolonged economic pressure affects cognitive performance itself. People under sustained financial strain often experience reduced mental bandwidth for long-term planning, increased anxiety, decision fatigue, and heightened stress responses. In simpler terms, constantly surviving consumes enormous psychological energy, which explains why financial insecurity spreads beyond money and starts affecting relationships, physical health, sleep quality, parenting, emotional regulation, and long-term ambition. People become less patient, less optimistic, less future-oriented, not because they lost discipline, because chronic instability trains the brain to prioritize immediate survival above everything else. And once millions of households begin living psychologically month to month at the same time, the effects start rippling outward into society itself. You see it in declining trust, in rising burnout, in political anger, in social division, in the growing sense that everyday life feels heavier than it used to, even for people who technically should be doing okay. But there is one category of financial pressure that sits above all the others because unlike rent, groceries, or utilities, this one carries something even more destabilizing than high cost: uncertainty. And that category is healthcare. Healthcare is where the illusion of financial stability in America often collapses completely. Because unlike rent or groceries, medical costs do not arrive in predictable amounts. You cannot budget accurately for a diagnosis. You cannot schedule when your body will fail, when a child gets sick, when an accident happens, or when a routine checkup suddenly becomes something far more serious. And that unpredictability changes how people live long before they ever enter a hospital. For millions of Americans, healthcare is not just a service. It is a source of permanent financial anxiety. What makes this especially important is that insurance does not eliminate the fear the way many people assume it does. Deductibles, co-pays, coverage gaps, prescription costs, out-of-network charges, surprise billing. Even insured households can suddenly face thousands of dollars in expenses after receiving care they genuinely needed. That reality has produced something almost uniquely American. People fearing medical bills nearly as much as the illness itself. The Kaiser Family Foundation has repeatedly found that a significant share of American adults carry medical debt in some form. And many of them were insured when the debt occurred. They followed the rules. They had coverage. They sought treatment. They still ended up financially damaged afterward. Think about what that does psychologically. It teaches people that even doing the responsible thing can still punish them. And once people internalize that lesson, their behavior changes in dangerous ways. Doctor appointments get postponed. Symptoms get ignored. Prescriptions get stretched longer than directed. Preventive screenings disappear from the budget. Not because people suddenly stop caring about their health, but because every interaction with the healthcare system carries financial uncertainty attached to it. Someone feels chest pain and hesitates before going to the emergency room. Not because they underestimate the risk,